before, right? This is just
I was going to finish.
Oh,
over.
And that's the number.
all right. Well, it's officially 1 o'clock Eastern time here, and let's get rocking and rolling. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're tuning in from today. And welcome to today's webinar, Sustainable Nutrition Meets Sustainability on the Farm, What Healthcare Professionals Need to Know. My name is Beth Stark, and I'm a registered dietitian nutritionist and the Director of Nutrition Outreach with Northeast Beef Promotion Initiative, or NEBPI for short. If you're wondering who is NEBPI, we are a small but mighty team housed within the PA Beef Council that works on behalf of beef farmers and ranchers to develop and execute programming through the beef checkoff for healthcare professionals, consumers, retail and food service professionals in the Northeast region that encompasses the states of Maine south to Virginia. In addition to today's webinar that we'll get to in just one short moment, I also want to encourage you to sign up for the remaining webinar in this year's series that's coming up on August 9th, also at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, featuring chef and registered dietitians Abby Gelman and Julie Lopez, who will be hosting a webinar cooking demo combo entitled Optimal Nutrition at All Ages, Culinary Nutrition for the Early Years and Beyond. Now, you'll receive some more information and a registration link for this webinar in the email that follows today's presentation. So let me just go into the quick housekeeping items real briefly. Today's webinar is being hosted via Zoom webinar, where your camera and microphone are disabled for an optimized viewing experience. If you have any questions during the webinar, please make sure to use the Q&A feature, and we'll hold a Q&A portion at the end of the first portion of our webinar, as well as then the second portion as well. We are recording this webinar, so if you'd have to hop off for whatever reason, you will be able to access this recording later on. As noted, you will receive a follow-up email later today, and in that will contain the link to the recording of today's webinar, a survey link, your CPEU certificate, and the registration link for the August webinar. So now let's get into the main event. I am so pleased today to introduce our first fabulous presenter, Sheri Glazier, a fifth-generation agriculturist, Oklahoma farmer, and registered dietitian. Sheri Glazier uses the on-the-job training and a bachelor's and master's in nutrition sciences degrees to build a bridge between nutrition and agriculture through her business, Dirt Road Dietitian, LLC. Sheri was not only honored as Oklahoma Dietitian of the Year, she was also named a rising star by her alma mater, Oklahoma State University, and the College of Human Sciences. In addition to serving Oklahomans through her business, Dirt Road Dietitian, Sheri farms with her family, who was recently recognized as Oklahoma Farm Bureau's District 3 Farm and Ranch Family of the Year near Loyal, Oklahoma, where they raise cattle, crops, and sell directly to consumers through their brand, Glazier Farms. So without further ado, welcome, Sheri, and please take it away.
What an honor it is to be with you guys today. This is just a really fun topic that I'm really excited to bring to you. Sustainable nutrition meets sustainability on the farm. These are the two worlds that I definitely live in. And we're going to leave you today with some tips and tricks of really what do you guys as health professionals really need to know. And with that, as always, I really thank the beef farmers and ranchers of Northeast Beef Promotion Initiative to make this possible today, and them doing all the hard work and things out on their farms and ranches to be able to bring this topic to light to you as well too. So ultimately, what are we going to be doing today is really, we're going to explore some sustainable eating patterns and really examine the role that what you guys can do as healthcare providers when you educate your patients and clients. We're going to look at those true definitions and ultimately what impact does that have when consumers are at the grocery store, and how are those sustainability thoughts guiding their purchasing decisions. And then ultimately, again, what can we do about that? What impact does that have for us as clinicians? And then finally, we're going to end it with some agricultural discussion on sustainability as well too. And you'll get a peek at our on the farm practices as well too before we head on over to Amy's with that. So with no further ado, we're going to kind of get into the nitty gritty. And ultimately, whenever we use this word sustainability is one that, it has three pillars: environmental, social, and economic. But it's also something that we typically, whenever we hear that word sustainability, I think our minds usually typically go to the environmental aspect, right? And so we're thinking of that natural resource management, the natural resources that we have. But if we don't have the adequate food access in that social realm, while also being economically viable, right? So we have to be financially viable in these as well too. We need all those three pillars. Basically, those three legs have got to be able to stand for that to be overall truly sustainable. And I think this image of this and animal agriculture really kind of ties this whole thought process together. And I really want to bring to light too that it's way more complex than sometimes what meets the eye, right? This is not a simple. I don't want to oversimplify this topic. And then from that, I know as nutrition and health professionals, we think about this a lot as far as sustainable diets and the recommendations that we make and what impact do they make. And this definition is from FAO. And so sustainable diets are those diets with low environmental impacts, but contribute to food nutrition security, healthy life for present and future generations. Sustainable diets are protective and respectful of biodiversity, ecosystems, culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair, affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe, and healthy, while also optimizing natural and human resources. And if you read through that, you're like, oh my gosh, like there is just a lot encompassed in there. And that's really something I don't think we need to take lightly either. And so ultimately what we're going to do from here and kind of moving towards is we'll kind of really examine the ecosystem part of this, really being coherent of being culturally acceptable, while also being identifying what is accessible to our people, what is economically fair, affordable, and that nutritionally adequate as well too. While on the agricultural side, how are we optimizing our natural resources that we have available to us as well? So a very complex topic that I don't want to oversimplify either, but as we'll kind of dig through these things, and hopefully we'll be able to come away with some things that are actually applicable to you and hopefully just really make more sense as we move forward. And so let's kind of zoom out. Let's look at big picture. And I think what we really need to be mindful of as far as sustainable diets and sustainable eating, there are so many ways to eat a healthy and sustainable diet, right? Science tells us there's a lot of ways that people can accomplish this. And I think, modeling the My Plate and teaching from that plate is really helpful for that as well too. But I think as you dig deeper and what is important to us, what's important to your client, right? We have to figure out what's really important for them. And I think in our education systems, we always are taught that gold standard. Where do we want everyone to be? And sometimes we kind of forget that a lot of times we have to meet people where they are, right? And so ultimately digging deeper, and that's where the personalized nutrition aspect becomes so important here, providing people with this basic foundational knowledge of nutrition, and ultimately making recommendations that are ultimately sustainable for them, right? Do they have access to these food recommendations we're making, and is it realistic within their own home and their socioeconomic status? And so as we move forward in the sustainability conversation, and ultimately we'll be looking at a little bit more of the environmental aspect of the sustainability conversation, right? Americans are concerned about the environmental impact. Gen Zers are a little bit more concerned about that. So 73% believe their generation is more concerned about the environmental impact of their food choices, while ultimately over half of Americans do believe that their choices have an impact ultimately on the environment. And so what continues to rise in concern ultimately is this environmental sustainability. And this is talking about, in the grocery store, purchasing decisions as they're shopping and adding things to their grocery cart. And some of this conversation has to do with food waste, right? So over half of respondents are very to somewhat concerned about their impact on food waste. And then there becomes a division, ultimately a generational division on the impact. What is that food waste? Where does that really stem from, that concern, right? So our Gen X and boomers, it's much more financial, right? They're taught not to waste. And I think the generational impact to that of our current generation too is the Clean Your Plate Club, right? And so we still have patients and clients that struggle with not eating everything on your plate because this generation was much more taught not to waste, and that aspect of that too. And then conversely, we kind of go to the millennial and Gen Zers, and they're much more mindful of their food waste and the environmental impact that ultimately has on them as well too. And then as we expand this conversation further, thinking about environmental sustainability, and then we go into labeling claims. And so labeling claims, they ultimately, for the most part, are going to make consumers feel better or feel worse about something they're doing. And so something that's making them feel better about whenever they're looking at this environmental sustainability standpoint, they respond that, hey, if it says natural on the label, or if it is identified as a clean ingredient, that makes them feel better about that from an environmental standpoint, right? Now, whether or not that it actually does make an impact, that's up for discussion, right? And so I wanted to provide you all with a definition of natural as far as meat and poultry labeling goes, as per USDA. And so USDA defines that as it's a product that contains no artificial ingredients, added color, and is only minimally processed. And ultimately, minimally processed means that it does not fundamentally alter that product. So the majority of beef products, poultry, pork, all those meat and poultry products at the grocery store are likely inherently natural, right? And so then the difference becomes, are they marketing it as that, right? And so does it say that word natural on the label? And then ultimately, is that creating a health halo for someone to feel better about that purchase that they are purchasing as well too? Then the other part of that too becomes affordability, right? So the likelihood, if it has more labeling claims on that, the likelihood of it costing a little bit more is probably going to be higher as well too. And then from that, we think through, so we're thinking about the health halo that surrounds natural. There's also a lot of raising claims on food labels. And this is something that just continues to confuse people. And I know as a registered dietitian and other health professionals I talk to, they're like, I need some more foundational knowledge of agriculture, because all these claims being made on these food products are really confusing me as well too. And so as we kind of dive through this, I wanted to kind of compare the nutritional profile of grass finished and grain finished beef here. And so we have two different beef strip steaks, both considered lean cuts. And as we compare these and go down the nutritional profiles of those, we look at calorically, it's less than 30 calories difference, proteins comparable, fat all meets the USDA standards for lean. We've got B12, zinc, iron, choline, all those are good to excellent sources as well too. So as you look at that nutritional profile, that's something that we must stay grounded in whenever we're dealing with all these raising claims as well too. The other piece of this puzzle too becomes affordability, right? And so, as I dug a little bit deeper in current grocery prices here where I am in Oklahoma, right? So affordability of grass finished versus grain finished there's about a $2 per pound difference. So we must be mindful in our recommendations to patients and clients when we have to take that into consideration as well too. The other difference for me, when someone asks me which to choose, I'm like, well, which one do you like, right? So where is that taste? Where does your allegiance align with the taste as well too? Some people prefer one that was raised one way over the other, and either way is 100% a-okay. And then accessibility to that as well too. So the majority of cattle that are finished in the United States are typically going to be finished on a grain ration diet. So that's likelihood the larger percentage that's going to be available at the grocery store as well too, which likely is going to lend back to that affordability piece too. And again, this kind of brings everything to light as far as, of what is the claims being made on the labels. And it really highlights the importance for all of us as health professionals to have a good foundational knowledge and understanding how food and ultimately animals are raised to help us ourselves and then to our clients and patients to make sense of all of those claims as well too. And so with all of that information and that elevation of concern in the environmental sustainability piece of that, ultimately, though, what is actually winning? And so what is actually winning when it comes to actually checking out at the grocery store? They're ultimately going to be purchasing things that taste good and things that are going to fit in their budget, right? So we want to have some money left over at the end, but we also really want food that tastes good, right? And so I think I know as a dietitian, there's that stereotype that, oh my gosh, she's just going to recommend something that tastes like cardboard, and that is definitely not my goal 100%. And so I want to help guide and align people with things that taste good, but also affordable, but also can meet some of the healthfulness factors as well too. And so as we kind of move forward in applicability of the sustainability conversation, I think it's really great to kind of ground us in where do we stand in dietary patterns. And the dietary guidelines definitely tells us that we are failing across basically all different life stages, right? So there's the way that I'm going to look at it is just we have a great area of opportunity to do better, right? And ultimately, where do we have the opportunities to do better? Ultimately, that lies in the fruit and vegetable conversation, right? So basically, 90% of us can do better in the fiber category, right? And so, but as we dig deeper through that, the question still arises is why? Why can we not fix this? What are our barriers to success in this fruit and vegetable conversation? And I really think in this word cloud, I know all of you can probably add to this word cloud as well too. But we go back to marketing, right? So we go back to labeling claims and raising claims of organic, natural, and clean, and those sorts of things. And I think there's a mindset too that if I can't get those things that feel like they're better for me, then I'm probably just not going to purchase them at all. And while we know that nutritionally, they're both nutritionally comparable either which way you choose, right? The statement that fresh is best, right? And so if you live 30 miles from a grocery store, your patients and clients, or the likelihood of you recommending something fresh is going to be really attainable for them long term? Probably not, right? They may live in a food desert like myself. We have to be very mindful of that sustainable nutrition recommendation as well too. The other piece of this also becomes kitchen skills, right? So the foundational knowledge of nutrition is kind of lacking, and the foundational knowledge of basic kitchen skills is something that can be improved on as well too, as far as our recommendations, right? So if we're asking someone to add chopped onion to a dish, do they even know how to do that, right? That may be something basic that we could show them. Even in the canned vegetable conversation, do they have a can opener? Things that we have to be really, really mindful of as we move forward with this. And again, I know all of you can add things to this that you're thinking of too, of why we have barriers to this. And so as we examine a little bit further of actual purchasing decisions, and this dashboard from Purdue University is really, really helpful. As we see up there in actual frequency of frozen food purchases in the realm of frozen vegetables. So 77% of respondents actually reported that they're purchasing frozen vegetables sometimes to always. And so I'm like, okay, great. That is a great thing, right? That's a large percentage of them purchasing them pretty frequently, right? Frozen fruit, we're down there to about 50% of the time, some area of opportunity there, okay? And so we know that, okay, they're purchasing specifically frozen food vegetable purchases, but how do they feel about that when it comes to nutrition? And so as we dig a little bit deeper in this specific graph here, we're going to identify and actually look at nutrition when it comes to vegetables. So we're going to look at right here. So they're looking at a lot of different things: taste, convenience, all these other parameters. What I wanted to dissect today was actually just nutrition. So when it comes down to actual vegetables and their thought of, from nutrition standpoint, is fresh or frozen when it comes to nutrition better, right? 77% of them are purchasing frozen, but when it comes down to that, 58% still believe that fresh veggies are somewhat to much better when it comes to nutrition, and about the same for fruit. So 51% still believe that fresh is somewhat to much better. And so there's a significant area there of opportunity for us, right? Because we know that fresh and frozen produce have comparable nutritional profiles, right? How can we as health professionals champion this messaging for clients, ultimately to help build their confidence to change this? They're already purchasing it. How can we champion that? Let's say, hey, this is part of a healthy dietary pattern. We want you to get confident with that, to even do it more often, right? We want people to find joy in the food that they eat, right? And maintain that positive relationship with food. And I think shifting this messaging is definitely part of that. That needs to be done as well too. And then kind of moving forward, so we've talked about access and affordability of some of those things, of the frozen and fresh dynamic of fruit and veggies. I think there's some other conversations to be had as far as nutrient density within that conversation too. So there's some specific nutrients that are very crucial during specific life stages, specifically iron, zinc, folate, vitamin B12, calcium, vitamin A, and protein. And basically we're talking about, babies and toddlers, adolescents, women of childbearing age, pregnancy, lactation, and older adults. So ultimately, that doesn't leave a whole lot of years in there, ultimately, for non-critical life stages, right? And so I think what we have to do from this point is really examine what foods really are going to meet these specific nutrient needs as well, too. And so what foods are nutrient dense? And this goes back to that sustainable diet definition from FAO, right? So nutritionally adequate foods. And so this is part of this conversation as we move forward. And then, so as we dig deeper in this study from Dr. Tybiel and looking at actual micronutrient density in certain foods that was just published in 2022, and kind of digging deeper and understanding, we have higher nutrient needs during certain stages of life, and which foods can we make sure that we encourage and get on those plates. And I think for most of us, we're not common eaters of organ meats. That's not something we typically would do, but other people from other countries very likely would. But as you dissect through this, I think you'll see definitely some commonalities of things that we can much more be mindful of, and making sure that they are recommended and make it on that plate as well too. Obviously, dark leafy greens, we've got beef, we've got eggs, we've got cow's milk, canned fish with bones, lamb, cheese, pork, yogurt, fish, and then we go down to pulses and quinoa, chickens on there, sorghum, and it just kind of rolls on down to, you can kind of examine that overall nutrient density. And I know as nutrition professionals, we really need to be mindful as like, okay, so we know that we can recommend nutrient dense foods, and then also emphasize the needs for balancing that plate out with these foods as well too, right? It takes the whole plate. There is not one single hero food here. We have to find ways to find balance and balance all of this out. And so as you think about those nutrient dense foods as well too, we'll look at, calorically. So they don't take a lot of calories, and they don't take up there's not a lot quantity of them needed. And so that's super helpful to know. And then through this as well too, looking at actual relative caloric price of those foods that we just talked about, that we can look at that, and we can see there in North America that milk, other dairy products like milk and yogurt, cheese and yogurt, eggs, white meats are by this definition under the very cheap category, and then unprocessed red meats are going to be in the cheap category when it comes to caloric cost, relative caloric cost of these. And so I think putting some of these things into perspective is very, very helpful. But it's also helpful for us to really examine this, to look at even if people are originating from outside of our country, and examining those cultures as well too, and understanding why things might be unfamiliar to them as well too. And so as we kind of want to wrap all this nutrition piece to this puzzle kind of all together, and we go back to that sustainable diet recommendation and thinking about access and affordability, and thinking about nutritionally adequate foods and those things as well too, I think we have a responsibility as nutrition health professionals to make sure we're recommending nutrient dense foods, especially if we're working with people that have those increased nutrient demands. And then from that, for those that choose to eat animal proteins, which as we saw, are the most nutrient dense, inclusion of specific fruits and veggies to complement those nutrient absorption is really, really impactful, right? They need specific meal pairings and specific meal ideas. And that's something they need as well too. And then the empowerment of saying, hey, I know you enjoy purchasing frozen veggies and frozen fruits. I want to empower you to continue that purchasing decision too, because it is impactful for your overall health. And then two, for our vegan and vegetarian friends, for those that aren't eating eggs, milk, and yogurt and those things, just to be mindful that we do still have to be mindful of making sure they are supplementing for those at-risk nutrient deficiencies. We need to directly address that. Because as I think through this as well too, as we're encouraging this increase of plant-based type foods and things too, we have to be mindful of this as far as our recommendation, that we're not sacrificing, that recommendation at the cost of these other nutrient dense foods from animal food sources as well too. Someone that may not be getting adequate nutrient dense foods like those, a Meatless Monday recommendation could ultimately be putting them at risk as well too. So we have to find ways to really balance out that plate, and balance out our recommendations for them as well. All right. And so as we kind of move forward here, we're going to kind of hop on over to this agricultural piece of that story, right? Because we know one thing, food, purchasing at the grocery store and then ultimately within our homes, but what's kind of happening on behind the scenes, ultimately at the farm level, and actually at the ground, right? And so we're going to kind of navigate through this as well too, looking at that ecosystem and those natural resources that we talked about in that sustainable diet definition. And so I really always enjoy looking at this map. This is ultimately the bright green is croplands in the United States. And just as a reminder, we're only looking at agriculture from a United States perspective as well too. You'll see in the Valley of California, it's the most diverse agricultural area that exists in the United States. There's a lot of brown on this map, right, where we're not able to actually plant things in the ground. And that land is what we call not suitable for crop production. But what it can grow is grass, and ultimately cattle can eat grass and upcycle that. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Then you get to the Midwest, where you'll see a lot more of row crops and corn, and soybeans and cotton and wheat and milo and sesame, and a lot of diverse things there too. And things are going to differ there. based on soil types, based on water availability. There's so many things that are going to impact what we're able to grow based on where you are. Then as you get further east, you'll see it gets darker green. Ultimately, we know that there's a lot more trees and hills in that area. And again, it makes it a lot more difficult to truly grow crops in the ground. So cattle are very integral in those areas as well too. And so from that, we think about agricultural land and land use. And ultimately what is happening is the available agricultural land just continues to decline, right? And so as those of us involved in agriculture, we have to be more efficient with our resources. We rely a significant amount on science and technology, GPS, seed genetics and those sorts of things too. Science is really at the heart of what we do. And because part of that becomes too, is there's just a rise in cost of everything, fuel, labor, equipment, all the things, just everything is more expensive. So it's more expensive for us at the grocery store. It's even more expensive for us to actually get it to you guys and to us as end users, as consumers as well too. So ultimately, we're having to produce more with less land and fewer resources. And as we think about this, we're like, well, Sheri, where's the land going? It's not going anywhere. It's just going into different uses, right? So it might be an apartment complex. It might be a housing addition. It might be a hospital. It might be a whole host of other things. But we have to be mindful of that because previously that land was likely used for grazing of cattle or growing of crops. And that is now ultimately not used for that any longer. So we have to figure out how do we do more ultimately with less? And so that's ultimately the challenge at hand for farms and ranches. And as I think through multi-generational farms and ranches, and even if you're just a business, is there really a better definition of sustainability, right? You have to have all three pillars standing, right, to be able to sustain things for multi-generations. But as I kind of work through this too, there's still a reality check of like, we've done a really poor job at communicating on farm practices, right? So those in agriculture have been busy doing the work and doing the things, but haven't done a great job at communicating this information and ultimately disconnect from there, which is sometimes why I choose ultimately to share on social media as well too, because as someone from a farm and ranch family and things of that sort, if I don't show you what's happening, how else are you supposed to know? And so part of this information ultimately come from that has been the environmental impact, basically overall of agriculture, and something we need to be grounded in and make sure that we understand that food ultimately doesn't come without cost, right? It's not for free because we think about the nutritional impacts that it ultimately does have on us. And so, it's going to cost something, but it's even giving us something even more, right? And so overall agriculture is 11% of that greenhouse gas emission piece of the pie. And two, this data is from EPA, and this is data from the United States, right? This is not global data. This is United States data. I am not the greenhouse gas emission expert. That's going to be a Dr. Frank Mittlerner or Dr. Sarah Place. But what I do know is from that 11% of ag, 2.3% of those greenhouse gas emissions is what comes from beef cattle, right? So it's still going to have some impact. But as we kind of move through that, I think there's much more to this story of what beef cattle are actually doing behind the scenes that sometimes we don't really think about that. And so if we really were to remove animal agriculture from this whole piece of the pie, I think about what could happen. And I think ultimately we have those nutrients of concern, right? We're going to have iron, zinc issues, choline, vitamin B12. And then from an agricultural standpoint, we're going to increase in water use, fertilizer use. Land would ultimately be having to be cropped that's not suitable for crop production. So we would have erosion. We would lose that topsoil. It would just wash away and go into our water sources. Ultimately, a whole host of issues. And I say this too, because as we have learned from history, right? So the tillage of soil that may not have been appropriate for crop production, Oklahoma's history is definitely the Dust Bowl. And we learned from that. And we definitely never want to go back to that ever again. And so, the other piece of this conversation too, as humans, we don't necessarily like to eat grass, but cattle do. Cattle like grass, they eat grass, and they actually they're grazing it on land that's ultimately not suitable for anything other than ruminant animals like they are. They take food that ultimately have minimal nutritional value, that's grass, and ultimately minimal nutritional value for us as humans, obviously, and then upcycle that into a high quality nutrient dense food source as well too. So ultimately I see them much more as part of this solution of being a piece to this larger puzzle. And if you think back to kind of the beef life cycle and what impact do cattle have on this overall beef life cycle chain, right? So cows graze on grass and they have their babies typically out on grasses as well too. And those babies will be with their mamas until they're weaned from about 6 to 8 months of age. And from them, I like to consider them about, college age. They're ready to fly, right? And so then there's another phase that's not pictured here of more of the stalker phase or backgrounding phase. And in Oklahoma, we rely heavily on the stalker phase. So when we grow wheat in Oklahoma, cattle graze on that wheat in the wintertime when everything else is dead, has no nutritional value, and we can bring cattle here and grow them. And then from there, they will go to a feed yard setting where they're finished at about 4 to 6 months on grain, or they would go to a grass finish setting where it takes about 12 months longer. And so as you kind of think through this, and we kind of go back to, again, the sustainable diet definition and looking at ecosystems and in this larger picture of things that are ultimately complementary to each other, right? So we start here ultimately in the cattle and beef production phase. We know that we're growing plants. We need plants. We know these things. We need it for our own food. We need it for fiber from the form of cotton, right? We love us some cotton clothes, but also biofuels as well too, as far as ethanol production. So those things go into things that ultimately us as humans are using. The reality is we can't use the whole product. We can't use the whole thing. So there's always going to be something left over, right? And so what's left over from cotton? Cotton is cotton seed hulls and cotton seed hulls. And then we also have dried distillers grains left over from ethanol production, right? So we have these two things that are ultimately left over that before they identified that, hey, we can feed these to cattle, they otherwise had no value, which ultimately leads to they're going to end up in a landfill that have no use, which is not what we want to happen, right? And so ultimately they can upcycle these and back to cattle feed in that grain finishing phase. Then the other piece of this puzzle in the ecosystem is ultimately cattle are grazing on those non-croppable lands of pasture and range lands as well too, while also ultimately spreading fertilizer in the form of manure as well too. So there's a much larger picture for those of us that are involved in this that really rely on each sector to make each one of us better as well too. And so as you can see, there is a piece to the food waste puzzle here that plays into the sustainability story as well too. And so as we talk about food waste, we all know food waste is a significant concern, right? And so food waste happens obviously at the farm, it's happening in packaging and distribution, but it's also obviously happening at the grocery store and ultimately within our homes. So the largest at the farm obviously is going to be fruit and veggies. And ultimately that really has to do, if you think about it, weather changes. So if you have a freeze, flood, you could have, insect pressure, all sorts of things that can really impact that, but also if you think through labor issues as well too, if something is ripe and ready to be harvested and we have labor shortages, that's going to impact that negatively as well too. And ultimately you think about it, that farmer already has all the input costs, their time, their fuel, fertilizer, seed costs, all the things already into that. And if they can't harvest that is a really not a good situation. That is not a sustainable option there either. Then ultimately it goes into homes, have the other large piece to this pie. So what we're going to look at from here, as you guys kind of have already seen, how can we mitigate some of this food waste category in the form of feeding animals? And so I think this is a really neat and encouraging thing to think through, that over 12.5 million tons of human food waste ultimately is currently being diverted to animal feed within California's livestock feed industry. So as I mentioned, California is one of the most diverse agricultural states that exists. They have a unique climate there that allowed them to do a lot of different things. However, when we go to the grocery store, everything is always perfect, right? The colors are perfect. There's no imperfections on anything. And I think in reality, if you've ever grown a garden, you know that what you grow is not what it looks like at the grocery store. And so that image on the left ultimately is a big old pile of onions that didn't meet spec to be able to be sold in the retail setting. And so what are they able to do with that? So basically what they're able to do is they can take the onions and work that into a feed ration with the work of a ruminant nutritionist, work that into a feed ration to feed dairy cows, to feed beef cattle, whatever that looks like, wherever they can use that. So ultimately something that otherwise would have gone wasted is able to incorporate that back in. And then we think about the nutrients that beef is able to provide us. That's a really positive impact. Then the image on the right is just a grain finished ration. That's actually a ration that's fed in the Panhandle here at a buffalo feeders here in Oklahoma. And it's always just a mix of different things. People think, grain finish is mainly grain. That's actually not the case, but Other things that we can add into that is dried distillers grains, obviously those cottonseed hulls, potato waste, because we don't always really like those peels of potatoes. And so, yes, they're not going to waste. Wheat middlings, which would be the basically the byproduct of all-purpose flour, pineapple waste, and again, that imperfect produce as well too. So we think from that standpoint, but then I also want to kind of go into this other larger agricultural picture that's not so much, in where it's a very agricultural diverse area, but in West Central Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, we basically have a grazing pattern that we're able to do with wheat. So we plant wheat in the fall, then we are able to graze wheat during all the winter time. So it's nice and green when everything else is dead. It's a really high protein source for cattle. Then ultimately in March, those cattle are taken off of wheat, and then those cattle will go to feed yard settings anywhere from 3 to 6 months. And then that wheat allows it to grow. So 3 months to grow. And then ultimately we harvest that wheat for grain. And those types of wheat varieties are specifically bred for that. And so they're basically called from Oklahoma State, they're graze and grain. So we can graze them and raise them for grain. Other areas of the Midwest that actually have corn that have more water than we do here in Oklahoma, but they can harvest corn in the fall, and there's always residue left behind. And so they can able to turn those cows out again in the winter time when everything else is dead and dormant, that they can turn cows out to graze what was left over from that too. And then ultimately eventually come behind those cows that have left fertilizer behind them and plant another crop from that too. And then go back to California, and I go back and think about things like the things that we demand as consumers of pulp-free orange juice, right? Where do we do with that pulp? That's going to go into ultimately, it's going to go into cattle food sources as well too. Almond hulls, we like almonds, we want people to eat almonds, but there's a hull and we can feed those to cattle too. And so there's a lot of things that we really think about that, we as humans don't use that whole food product, and it's not going to go to waste either, because cattle are able to upcycle that as well too. So what I wanted to kind of do now was kind of give you a little bit of a tour of where I am in Oklahoma, and the other dot up there in Pennsylvania is where Amy is, that you'll get to meet her in just a little bit. And I think it's always just helpful to be able to see two different agricultural stories. You're going to hear someone talk about their farm and you'll be like, well, Sheri and Amy don't do anything like that. And I think that's absolutely the point. We are using the resources we have available to us the best that we have, right? And so that's what plays into this larger sustainability story. And so for us here in Oklahoma, further to our west is much more rangeland. It is not croppable area. It actually reminds me a little bit more of New Mexico. And then we're in a more croppable area, primarily wheat, but there's also some corn, cotton, and soybeans growing in my neck of the woods. And as you go further east, you definitely get into the trees and hills. And again, it's non-croppable area where cattle are very much part of that. And so this is welcome to a really small farming community called Loyal, Oklahoma. So my husband, Kyle, and I, and those are our two kiddos, but Kyle and I are both fifth generation agriculturalists. We both grew up on conventional tillage farms, meaning we tilled the soil and primarily stocker cattle and wheat operations. And that's primarily what we knew. As we have kind of taken on our own identity and started doing our own things. And ultimately, for the sake of what does our long-term sustainability story look like? Again, we go into rising costs and rising input costs and fuel and equipment and labor. We need to shift a little bit. And so ultimately in 2017, we shifted to more of a minimal to no-till farming environment. We still raise wheat, and that's definitely part of what we do. We like to try new and different varieties. Like there's one that's a beardless wheat that we're growing right now. It has no beards, but it's a white winter wheat as well too. So we can get the attributes of all-purpose flour, but it's still a whole grain and those nutrients of whole grain as well too. So that's a really great thing for us to be able to do. Crop diversity is something we have dove on into as well. Growing things like milo, which is a grain sorghum. Ultimately, that one would be for cattle feed. And then sesame, we've dove on into that and tried that a few times as well too. And that goes into sesame oil that we love for our flavorings of those things as well too. The other piece of that puzzle is we also try to keep things growing and keep things alive. And cover crops have kind of helped us to do that as well too. So after we harvest wheat in June, likely the goal is that we will go in and plant some other crops behind that to keep cover for our ground and to keep those living organisms alive and well. The caveat to all this is we still need moisture for things to grow. So we still need moisture. We don't get a lot of that, which is why the majority of our crops really revolve around drought. They're all drought tolerant, and that's something we have to be very mindful of as we move forward. And then from that, I kind of wanted to take you through just the graze and grain conversation. That's us there in our early days. And number one, then number two, as we have shifted to much more of a no-till environment, that's an air seeder drilled. The air actually pushes the seed and the fertilizer to the back of that drill. And then there are discs that create a furrow, and that furrow plants that seed and it covers it up. And then hopefully it rains, and then we'll be able to graze cattle there during the winter there for us here in Oklahoma. And then for us, we don't finish cattle here. We usually will sell them and they'll end up at a feed yard setting. But we always keep some back to be able to finish ourselves on a smaller scale, to be able to make that available in our direct to consumer beef business as well too. And then from there, ultimately what is occurring right now where we are is number four, where the wheat is starting to what we call head out and produce the grain, but we also have to survive severe weather season as well too. And so that field right there just had an impact of high winds and water, and sometimes it will lay down and not pop back up. So that's a concern. And then we just hopefully we'll transition to June very smoothly, and be able to harvest our wheat for grain. And just like over 92% of farms and ranches in the United States, ours is just family owned. It's just our family trying to raise food for human consumption for the United States and the world. And I mentioned this statement many a times of not being suitable for crop production. And so many years ago, Oklahoma, it was really incentivized ultimately to grow wheat. And so there was a lot of land that was taken out of grass and to try to grow wheat. And here we are many, many years later. And Kyle and I are identifying that not all is a long-term sustainable solution when it comes to raising crops. And so we're working with Natural Resource Conservation Service to really identify the land that needs to be put back to grass. And we're slowly kind of doing that as well too, because ultimately everything that we do revolves around cattle. They have to complement everything that we do. Our crops need to complement cattle, and the cattle need to complement our crops as well too. And then through that, I know it always seems so, sometimes so romantic of living a life in agriculture, but I also want to be very realistic with you guys as well too, that while there are times that it's beautiful and we have green grass going, we also endure negative 21 degrees and blizzards. And this picture image, the image here it was a 100-year blizzard. No one in our extended families had ever experienced anything like that. And we did just 2 years ago. And then what followed that too is what we're currently experiencing is extreme and exceptional drought conditions, right? And so there's a lot of ups and downs. They call it the whiplash, basically what we have sometimes right now too. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if our animals aren't well taken care of, then ultimately we're not going to be in business. And we work so very closely with our veterinarian as far as vaccination protocols, if our animals are sick and if they need an antibiotic and all those sorts of things that we really, as far as taking care of our animals to the best that we can possible, that's obviously our ultimate goal. And as you can see there in the bottom left, usually our kids are watching and alongside with us the whole way as well too. And so we want to make sure that we are teaching them the best way that we know possible. And so with that, that's a lot of information, right? And so just like we trust our veterinarian, I think it's important for you guys to remember, as health professionals, the public trusts you guys as well too, right? And so we want to think about that, like what can you actually do about that? And I want just to remind you that you do have an impact. You have an impact on your recommendations. And so from that, we really want to go back, to the sustainable diet definition and thinking about that ecosystem. Are the foods that we're recommending, are they nutritionally adequate? Are they affordable? Are they accessible, right? Your recommendations truly do matter. And so with that, I'm going to leave you with kind of three kind of take homes to really truly focus on nutrient dense foods to fill common nutrient gaps. I don't really feel like we can take that lightly. And that includes, whether we're recommending frozen, canned, or fresh produce, and pairing that with nutrient dense proteins that they ultimately enjoy, right? Because it goes back to that taste, those purchase drivers of taste as well too. And we want to help them build and balance out that plate that's actually realistic and, again, sustainable for them in the form of like, can they actually make this happen? And then secondly, we must consider access and affordability, right? And reminding them, we have to be careful of those health halos and reminding them that there are no nutritional differences between organic and conventional, even when it comes to produce and meat and poultry as well too. And going back to empowering that thought of, hey, frozen veggies are just as nutritious as they are fresh. You're already buying them, so let's get confident about that. And then finally, where can we have the biggest impact when it comes to this environmental sustainability standpoint? And I think we go back to that food waste graph and ultimately what's happening within our own homes, right? We can always do better. I think we have to rely on agriculture to continue to do better as well too. But I think within our own homes, we have a responsibility there too. And so how do we reduce food waste? We want people to plan meals out better, right? So have an idea, what are we actually going to do? But then from that, I think taking that a step further is planning over with purpose. So having planned overs, like, okay, we already cooked that. What are we going to do with what's left? Even when it comes to our proteins, right? So if we're going to purchase something like ground beef, what can we purchase 1 or 2 or 3 pounds cheaper? And then can we go ahead and cook it all and freeze some of that other for later? But also, if we don't proactively label and freeze that for easy meals to come, and then what do? We open that up and we're like, what is this? This is the mystery bag. And sometimes those mystery bags never get consumed. That's something we can do better with, right? And then ultimately too, empowering frozen and canned fruit and veggie purchasing and consumption, because we've all heard that saying, I just bought the spinach or that bag salad for it to come home to my fridge to set there for a week or two, and then for me to put it in the trash. And I think about the farmer, I think about the input costs, the travel, all the things it took to get to our homes. And if we can't proactively put that, into our bodies and nourish ourselves, then gosh, that is just such a miss. And so from that, I hope you guys all feel empowered that you can really truly make some sustainable food recommendations that ultimately can positively impact your clients. And also I remind you that it's complex, and we just really need to take all of this one step at a time. And with that, that's all of my contact info where you can find me. And I will open it up now with Beth for any questions you guys may have.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sheri. You have done an amazing job at, really presenting such a deep topic, but I think presenting such great background information. And I love these tangible kind of takeaway tips for all the healthcare professionals here on our webinar today. And please do, I highly encourage you all to stay connected with Sheri just to learn more. I personally love following her journey and learning more about how she kind of brings that dietitian plus beef rancher combination together, which is such a unique package, and why again, I'm so glad that she's been here today. So we do have a couple of questions, and if you have not yet posed a question, but you do have a question, please drop it in the Q&A portion here, that tab at the bottom, so that I'm sure to see that. So I'll just jump right in. So Sheri, can you address if there are any differences in nutrition, aside from maybe micro and macronutrients, between both grain finished and grass finished? So we know as dietitians, this is a very big topic and one we get a lot of questions about. So it sounds like there's some sustainable benefits and disadvantages for both grain versus grass. So can you address maybe the nutrition perspective on that?
Yeah. So it's one of the questions that I probably get most often whenever we talk about beef and beef production and all those sorts of things. And a lot of it comes down to the polyunsaturated fatty acid conversation, right? So when it comes down to beef's fatty acid profile, over half of it is actually monounsaturated fatty acids. And then like 42% of that is saturated fat, but a third of that is actually stearic acid. And then a very small sliver of that is polyunsaturated fatty acids. When it comes down to the difference between grass finished and grain finished beef profiles, there are times that grass finished beef gets that accolade for, hey, it has twice the amount of omega-3 fatty acids. As you dig through that and you dig through what data is available, that's an accurate statement. Okay. The accurate statement, though, becomes an applicability. So grass finished beef has about 40 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids, and grain finished beef has about 20 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids. So 20 versus 40. That double thought is real, but when you put that into comparison of something like salmon, right? That's something that we really need to be doing better at too. We know that where that's going to be 750 to 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams, right? So ultimately, the difference between those nutritional differences between how those two are raised is just not significant enough for me as a dietitian for you to say, hey, you need to be recommending one over the other. Because part of that ultimately goes into, we go back to the agricultural story of that too, that, what is the most sustainable option? And I think both are going to be our sustainable options. And it just depends on where they are in their agricultural story and what resources people have available to them to make that, again, affordable and accessible to the end user as well too.
Absolutely. And actually, I'll make sure to in our follow-up communication to drop. There's a really great resource that does a nutrition comparison of grass finished versus grain finished, and so you can really dig in to what that profile looks like, as Sheri just shared. And it's even a resource you could share with your patients and clients. So thank you for that really great question. That's such a hot topic, I know, for the dietitian crowd that might be joining us today. So another question is about the use of waste products to feed ruminants under an animal nutritionist is fantastic. So does what is used, so for example, onions or cotton, plant leftovers, et cetera, to feed the cattle affect the quality or the taste of this meat? I don't know if you can address any kind of like how that nutrition piece kind of factors into then the end product that us as consumers might be enjoying.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. And I think for me, where I'm from, like we don't have as much of that diversity that I'm directly connected to. So what I know most is actually the cottonseed hulls and the wheat middlings and those sorts of things. And ultimately, I think, again, we go back to the ruminant nutritionists that I know so well, that they work. And again, they're trying to balance carb, protein, and fat. And as that kind of goes, and I think really they're just balancing it out. Could it have some impact on taste of meat? I'm sure it could. I do not know that there's any research to support that all, but do I think it's going to be significant enough for it to go one way or the other? I do not, because I think there's so much happening in that gut microbiome of cattle that it's much more well studied actually than we know of humans. And so there's just so much going on those microbes and things that ultimately it's breaking it down, but ultimately the impact again becomes that nutritional profile. And that goes back to, taste, right? Which do you enjoy? And maybe we can start recommending, hey, if I want one that was finished with some onion because I really enjoy that, it may have some natural flavor in that. I do not know if that's actually the case, but it's just really empowering for me to think that us as human consumers are so accustomed to needing things perfect, right? So we go to the grocery store, and I know as a child, I'm like, I just think of the peppers. I think of all that. Everything is like without blemish. And then I try to grow something out here in my own garden, and I'm like, that is not what I can get there. So there's a big gap there too. And I think just being mindful that, we have really high standards, and there are people producing really high standards for our food too, but not everything's going to meet that standard. And then the cattle can ultimately play a role in that to mitigate some of this food waste.
Awesome answer to that question. And thank you so much for everyone who has dropped some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask Sheri to answer one more quick question, and then I promise that the remaining questions that are still in this chat box will be addressed as we kind of move over to Hershey, Pennsylvania, where Amy Hess is standing by at Bow Creek Farm. So this one I think is just, again, one to maybe at a high level address if you can, Sheri. So the question was just basically focused on the push for plant-based eating. Are you seeing any impact, or kind of how are you engaging your patients, clients, consumers on that plant-based conversation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think that we have to start here is, what is the definition of plant-based eating, right? And so when I ask somebody that, there is no true definition to start. But when I ask somebody that, what do they think about that? They automatically think it's vegan or vegetarian. They automatically think that it doesn't just mean like I need to eat more plants. And so I think we definitely need to start there, and being mindful of the terms that we're using. And if you're pushing something that may be more plant forward, maybe that makes sure they understand what you actually mean from that, right? And so that's something, because some people just they feel shame or they feel guilt because I do not want to go vegan. That's what they feel like, and that's okay, right? We know that that's okay, but we have to be very mindful in our word choice that we use there, because on the flip side, we also know that we're falling short in fiber too. So we basically need both of these conversations to really come together, because we know that we can be better together from both of those fronts. So I think the messaging of that as health professionals is really important for us moving forward. And part of that has to do with portion control too. We go back to the animal protein side of it. We have a tendency to want to eat too much of that too. And so I think there's an empowerment there that people really enjoy the taste of animal proteins, which is great, because we know they're going to get some of those key nutrients. But can we make sure that they understand portion size, and then help them really balance out that plate and really make it actually attainable for them? And I think that's where we're going to be set up for much more sustainable long-term nutrition solutions for them.
Awesome. I love how you kind of brought it back to the sustainable nutrition piece right there with that last sentence. So that was awesome. And I would love to have you just continue on, but we are just going to take a very brief pause here as we get the farm team set up here again in Hershey, PA. So you may hear a little bit of some background noise. Just please know once we have that farm there, you might have just seen her pop on there. We are going to be heading over to Bow Creek Farm in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and presenting our virtual farm tour piece. So we encourage you to continue dropping those questions in the chat box. Those questions that I have not yet been able to address with our speakers, we will get to those. I think Amy would also be able to address some of these as well. So please keep those questions coming, and just again, allow us a moment or two here to get the farm all set up and the technology rocking and rolling over there.
Hello, Amy. Are you able to hear us on the farm?
I can hear you.
Perfect. That's what we like to do. We're going to do a quick spotlight of signal test on the farm. Looks like we have a good signal on the farm and we can hear you.
Good.
If you can hear us, I think we are good
Yep.
to go, Beth.
Sounds good.
Okay, well, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Here we are joined now by Amy Hess. So let me just introduce our second portion of this webinar, this combination presentation plus virtual farm tour. So we are joined today by Amy Hess of Bow Creek Farm and Cattle Company. She is a first-generation farmer and rancher with her husband, Rob, in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Her passion for beef production and agriculture came later in life after working in other industries. The Hess pair expanded farm operations from production of forages and grains to include red Angus cattle and beef production. Bow Creek Beef is direct marketed through an online store, e-commerce website into local hotels and restaurants in the Hershey, Pennsylvania area. And over the years, an appreciation and sense of obligation to advocate for agriculture has evolved into a commitment to promote beef by serving as a member of the PA Beef Council Board. So I've had the pleasure of getting to know Amy and working with Amy on a variety of different opportunities like this over time. So we're just so thrilled to have you joining us today, Amy, from Bow Creek Farm in Hershey. Hello, and I guess
Hi, Beth.
we can jump right in.
Sounds
I know
good.
the weather today is not exactly what we had hoped in May in Pennsylvania. You just never know what you're going to get. So it is a little bit breezy and
Yes.
cool there. But we know that's a reality of farm life. It's not always blue skies, beautiful puffy clouds and sunshine, right?
No, definitely not. Not going to
All right.
romanticize it.
That's right. So if you could just go ahead, and I know I gave a very brief bio of you there, which barely scratched the surface. If you could just introduce yourself in maybe a more robust way and talk about your history of farming there at Bow Creek Farm.
Yeah, as Beth mentioned, I farm at Bow Creek Farm and I own and operate it with my husband, Rob. Rob and I, as Beth mentioned, are both first generation farmers and ranchers. We did not grow up from farming with a farming background. Both of us are originally from this area, just a few miles away from our current farm. We do have two children. We have a son that's 22 and he works off farm at a nuclear power plant. And our daughter, Anna, is 19 and she is currently just finishing up her freshman year at Penn State studying animal science. As I said, both Rob and I have worked in other industries before. We started farming full time. Really, Rob's love of farming started when he was about 12 or 13. He started working for a neighbor who is a big hay farmer in the area. They grow, I think, over 10,000 acres of hay and different crops in Pennsylvania. And he learned all about hay production and growing different crops and harvesting them. And later in his life, when he was a teenager, his parents purchased this farm that we're at right now as an investment and didn't farm it until he was a little older. He decided to start farming for a hobby. We've been married for 25 years. When we first got married, I was working at a money management firm in New York City and came back home to get married and start a family here. And so my love of agriculture, as Beth mentioned, came a little later than Rob's did. It took me a few years to really get into it. But just to tell you a little bit about our farm, the farm we're at right now is 68 acres. We do farm an additional 3 farms that are all connected to this one that make up about 400 acres. About 80 of those acres, there are cattle either housed or grazing on. There's about 15 to 30 acres every year that we grow corn and soybeans. That's a pretty small amount. It's generally the amount we need to feed our cattle for beef. And the remaining of those acres are all in hay production. For many years, hay is the only thing we had on this farm. That's how Rob started out. But it just sort of made sense to add cattle to the hay picture. And why do we grow hay? It's primarily because, and I don't know if you could just see in some of that that was just shown, our land is very hilly. The terrain is sort of difficult. It's got a lot of shale, some thinner topsoil. If you remember back to Sheri's picture where she showed the cropland in the United States, and you saw that dot where Hershey is, there was a lot of green just to the south of Hershey. That's some of the most fertile land in the country, but our farm does not sit on that. So what does really grow here really well is grass. So that's what we focus on. When we first got married, Rob had a couple of feeder steers that he would feed for his family and for his friends. And just over the years, we got more involved in cattle. We started off with a small herd of Hereford cattle, of Hereford cows. And then we added, in 2004, we purchased our first Red Angus cows. And that is the breed we predominantly raise now. You will see a few white faces if they'll come forward here at this barn. Those white faces are still, some of our animals are crossbreeds with Hereford and Red Angus. Rob likes to see those white faces in the herd now and then. So in addition to the hay that we raise, we do have about 45 Red Angus cows, and we have about 50 to 60 head of steers on feed at any one time that we're finishing for beef. And throughout the year, we finish about 80 to 90 head. All of that gets direct marketed through our on-farm store and retail sales. And we also have sales to local hotels and restaurants that way. And the remainder of our sales for our farm comes from selling breeding animals and also from selling hay. Most of the hay the farm does, dairy producers and also some that feed it to the area.
Awesome. My goodness. Well, your family there, you've got a lot going on at all times. So we are so grateful to be able to visit today, from afar. I really love the history. I think even after talking with you, I never realized you started kind of in the city in such a different setting, and it just brought you back to this passion area that now you're thriving in after, so many years of building your family farm. If you could explain a little bit, I know Sheri touched on this in her presentation as well. The life cycle of beef. So you kind of loosely touched on it there. If maybe you could give a little bit of a different picture. And I know we have some imagery that the viewers will be seeing kind of that associates with some of your talking points as well.
Yeah, sure. So as Sheri touched on, the beef life cycle, beef production in the United States is pretty complicated. Most animals change hands 3 to 4 times in their life cycle, but all beef starts out at a farm just like ours, at a farmer ranch, where there's a herd of breeding cows. And those cows produce 1 offspring per year. And I'm just going to stop and maybe make a definition of the word cow. People often use it when they're just referring to bovines in general, but a cow does mean that it's a female animal that's given birth. So that animal will give birth once a year. Some farms and ranches calve only in the spring, some calve in the fall, and some have animals that calve in both spring and fall. Here at Bow Creek Farm, we calve in the spring. So that's happening right now. And we expect all of our animals, they're generally calving between the month of April and will be finished by the end of May. So those animals are going to have a calf, generally 1. Sometimes twins are pretty common. There have been triplets and quadruplets known to happen, but it's not common at all. So that calf is going to be born. And when it's born, it's going to be about 60 to 100 pounds. And for the first few days and definitely weeks of its life, it's going to be sustained off its mother's milk. That calf is going to start to graze grass with its mom. And you can't really, this isn't a great place to see that happening. Unfortunately, due to rain, we can't really be in the pastures today, but out in our pastures, you'll see them at the other end of our farm. That's where all of our cows and their calves are right now. And they're out there, and luckily our grass has come in, so we've been able to move them out to that green grass. We like our calves to calve out at pasture. In this area of the country, we have a lot of rain and we don't like them calving in mud. So they're going to stay out at pasture with their moms all summer long. In the early fall, after they're about 6 to 10 months old, those calves are going to come back and the cows will come back to our main farm here, where we have different pens and room, and that's where they will be weaned. Weaning, as I said, happens when they're about 6 to 10 months old and about 450 to 700 pounds. We'll bring them back here to the farm and we'll separate the cows and calves. Cows will go on one side of the fence, calves on the other. That's called fence line weaning. And for a few days, they'll still be able to like touch noses and look at each other and see each other. So you'll hear the calves might bawl a little bit and cows will moo, but after a day or two, that stops. And we're sure to make sure that that is as stress-free as possible, because it is a stressful time in a calf's life to be weaned from its mother. When we do that, we make sure that there's some fresh hay, some clean hay and fresh water right near the fence where their moms will be, so they don't have to travel far for anything. So after that weaning, that's generally the first time that animals could be sold. And as Sheri mentioned that she's a stocker, those animals at that time could be sold to a stocker or backgrounder, and they're going to go and continue to graze. They might eat some crop residues depending on resources, or they might be fed some other supplemental feed. But again, they're going to stay there grazing and growing for until they're about 9 months to a year old. And at this point, again, they might be sold to an auction or might be sent directly to a feedlot. Animals are sent to a feedlot, again, like I said, when they're about 9 months to a year old. And at the feedlot, there's going to be some changes. Generally, when cattle change hands, it's because of their changing nutritional requirements and the resources that are available where they are. Sheri said that like she doesn't have quite the resources to finish great numbers of cattle at one time, but other places in the Midwest have those crop resources to feed. And cattle go, they require a lot more energy to have enough energy and protein to build muscle and put on that weight that they need to be finished. So at a feedlot, there's a nutritionist that will develop a balanced ration for them to add the amount of energy and protein that they'll need to put on those pounds and that muscle. And so they'll have, their diet will change from probably almost all of grass to about 50 to 85% will be grains of some sort. Corn, soybean meal, wheat midds, distillers grains, byproducts that Sheri mentioned from other food production, they'll all be added to the diet. And what that does is it makes feeding beef much more efficient. You're using less feed to get more pounds of beef. And so then when they're at the feedlot, all feedlots have their space in pens where they have enough room to display some of their natural behaviors. They have room to move around, to lay down. There's enough room at their bunks and at their feed and water troughs for them all to have room to eat and play. So at the feed yard, like I said, there's going to be nutritionists, there's going to be pen riders, there's going to be veterinarians. At some of these larger feed yards, those people are there 24 hours a day to care for cattle. And cattle will stay there until they're about 18 to 22 months old. And they weigh anywhere from, when they're finished at market weight, 1,200 to 1,400 pounds. So at that point, when they reach market weight, they're going to then again be sold to either at an auction house or directly to a packing plant, where they'll be processed for beef. When they arrive at the packing plant, then they're there under the observation of USDA inspectors. Inspectors are there to see animals coming into the plant, and they stay there for the entire process of processing beef, all the way until it leaves to travel to food service. Are at the make sure that there's no signs of disease or injury. They're looking at carcasses to make sure there's no carcass that might be there from any kind of treatments or injections. If they suspect something, that meat will be tested for residues. And also they're just doing random tests for residues, regardless of whether or not they suspect anything from an animal. So.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, that was such a great kind of like depiction. And again, we were having some of the imagery and some video that accompanied some of the things you were sharing there. Definitely a lot of information to process for sure. But I think, again, you painted a really great picture of like that start to finish kind of process. I also like how you wove in the multidisciplinary team piece, because I think, again, as healthcare professionals, we can kind of all relate to that. When you're giving your patients or clients the best care, there's typically multiple, experts that are involved in that process. You obviously mentioned the nutritionist piece as well. So I think maybe kind of like tying in with that, and we also got a question in, so this is a good time to address this. If you want to talk about further, I guess, on the care piece of antibiotic usage. Sure. And how you care for those animals to optimize their health.
And talking about the multidisciplinary piece, if I could just mention I didn't discuss where we are standing right now today. This is where when after animals are weaned, we bring them back here, and this is where we finish cattle for beef. We call it a barn, but it's really just a roof, and the back portion of it is all curtains that we can open or close depending on the weather. We could close it if there's high winds or snow, and we can open it when we need more airflow. And in designing this barn, we depend on a lot of experts to help us out. We've contacted experts from the Penn State Extension for the design of the barn to make sure it was faced in the correct direction to get appropriate wind flow. They designed it to house the number of cattle we wanted in here to make sure each pen had the correct number of square footage. And unfortunately, the guys are being a little stubborn. They usually come out and start eating when we're here, but this is the time of day where they're sitting and chewing their cud all day. So they're being a little lazy, but so hopefully you can see them in there. But if you can see in the pen, it's also designed to keep them in low stress. One of the things that we think about every day with all of our cattle, whether they're their cows or they're the steers in these pens, is the lowest stress environment we can put them in. We're going to make the highest quality beef with the smallest amount of resources. It's really going to affect the product that we produce in the end. So this barn was designed to have these bed packs where you see a lot of animals in right now. It's got some dry bedding in there and some good footing that they can feel secure and lay down. And you can see there's some animals in there chewing their cud. That's always a good sign to us beef producers that the animal is content and healthy. And this front section where you see a few heads sticking out down here, they're at the feed bunk. Every day we come through here and we mix a new beef ration, and it is put out with our TMR mixer. That's a total mixed ration mixer. And in this ration, you can see, like I said, in a feed yard, the roughage or the grass is mixed in with all of the grains. On our farm, because we grow dry hay and we bale dry hay, our roughage is going to remain as dry hay. That's about 20% of the ration. And the remaining 80% is all going to be corn. There's some roasted soybeans in here, barley, and vitamins and minerals, which are really important for them to get as well, and some salt. Mm-hmm. So you can see that that feed is left there for them to eat whenever they feel like it. We refresh it every day. Even though there's always some there, every day when you come through with the TMR mixer, they always think it's fresh new stuff and they come running and all of their heads will be out. My husband will, the TMR mixer is a big bin that goes on the back of a tractor, and he backs it up here, and a chute comes down and all of the feed comes out, and they've all got their heads here waiting for that feed to come out. Like I said, they think it's special somehow or fresh, but it's the same as the mix was the day before. And what's really great about the TMR mixer is by mixing all of this feed and the hay together, it makes the cattle more efficient. We see that they get to market weight in shorter time, and they also put on more pound meat in the end.
Got it. Awesome.
And then
No, I think,
we
yeah, I'm
can
sorry,
walk
kind
down
of
this
didn't
way
ask
and
you to
talking.
introduce that space. Yeah, no, continue on. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Amy.
No, that's okay. And talking about animal care, like I said, every day we're thinking of how we can raise animals in the low stress as possible. Animal welfare is a priority for us at every stage. It's not just the right thing to do. It just makes good business sense. As I said, healthy, content animals produce the highest quality beef with the fewest resources and the fewest time and the least money. So it really doesn't make sense for us to mistreat our animals or to not treat them well. And part of that, like I said, is making sure that they are stress-free in this barn. But I also worry about stressors that are in our that are in our pastures bothering our cows. Things like sunlight, we make sure that they have plenty of shade to get out of the sun and heat. We have windbreaks for in the winter that they can shield themselves from high winds. We worry about things like flies and other parasites like worms and lice. We have an oiler in the pasture where cows can rub up against it and they get an oil on them that keeps flies away. And one of the things that we worry a lot about is mud. I know Sheri, I wish I could give Sheri some of our moisture we get in Pennsylvania. That's one of the reasons why we have this barn to finish beef. The moisture that we receive here can really decrease efficiency with finishing cattle. We get anywhere from 34 to 50 inches of rain a year. That's not the most rainiest state, but when you combine that with some of the temperatures we have in the winter, that rain with 35 and 40-degree temperatures can be really hard on cattle. And they're going to require a lot more energy just for their normal bodily functions. So they require even more to be able to gain weight and put on that muscle that we want them to when we're finishing them for beef. So the roof on this barn really helps us do that and helps us shield them from that moisture.
Awesome. No, I love how you touched on a variety of different pieces of like the care kind of like conversation there. And I love, again, going back to the nutrition piece, like how well prescribed what these animals are eating to really optimize their efficiency, produce a nutritious and delicious product for consumers that are enjoying beef, and so on and so forth. Maybe just kind of coming back to something you had mentioned regarding kind of at the finished state when the beef is being kind of processed. You touched a little bit on like testing by the USDA for safety, and I think that kind of would tie into a hot topic among a healthcare professional crowd regarding antibiotic and or growth hormone use.
Sure.
So what's being tested for? How are they ensuring a safe product for us that are consuming it? So I'll let you take it from there.
Sure, and that really starts on the farm. We do use antibiotics on the farm whenever there's a situation of disease or injury, and we use them under a veterinarian's direction. We would definitely follow all dosage for that antibiotic, and we'd follow withdrawal times. That's a federal law to follow withdrawal times to ensure that there is no residue left in the meat when it goes for processing. And some of those guidelines with any kind of treatments, whether that's a vaccination, an antibiotic, we follow BQA guidelines, that's beef quality assurance. Those are some guidelines that help ranchers use best management practices for raising cattle and scientific-based knowledge for raising cattle and producing wholesome beef. BQA is a national program, and I believe that about 80% of ranchers are BQA certified. So we definitely look to those BQA guidelines whenever we're treating animals for anything. Even like I said, the BQA talks about, gives guidelines for housing animals, for feeding, for treating vaccinations, or anytime there's illness. There's also guidelines for transporting animals and handling them, to make sure we're handling animals in a really low stress way. Like I said, we do use antibiotics now and then on the farm. It doesn't happen very often, but we use those under a veterinarian's care and guidance. We have a really close relationship with our veterinarian. She knows every part of our farm. She knows all of our practices. So we refer to her a lot when we have a situation that we're not sure about, and just when we need advice on a practice and what would be best for us. As far as hormone use goes, some feedlots do use hormones. That hormone is actually an implant that's probably about the size of a Tic Tac, and it's placed in the ear, and it stimulates a gland in cattle that naturally produces more growth hormones. Those are used to replace the growth hormones that are lost when bulls are castrated. And I'm going to go back and jump back to one of my definitions that I kind of skipped over. When a cow has a calf, it's either a heifer or a bull. A heifer would be a female that hasn't given birth yet, and a bull would be a male bovine. On our farm, we are raising animals for breeding animals, so we're going to keep them in our herd, but we're also raising some to then raise for beef and sell that beef. Any animal that's raised for breeding, we would keep them intact as a bull, but animals that we know are going to go for beef, they would be castrated like a day or two after birth. We feel that's the time where we can do that with the least amount of stress to them. So we don't use hormones here, but that's pretty much only because of the way we're finishing animals. We're not finishing large groups of animals to be ready to go to a packer at one time. We're selling beef from our farm, so we finish them on a weekly basis, and it just kind of doesn't make sense for our farm. It would be too much work to do. But the use of hormones really does help to make beef more sustainable. You're growing more beef with less resources using them. And there really is a insignificant difference in the hormone levels in beef that was from implanted animals and non-implanted animals. I think in a 3-ounce serving of beef from an implanted animal, there's 1.9 nanograms of hormones. That's a nanogram is a billionth of a gram. In non-implanted beef, in that 3-ounce serving, there would be 1.5 nanograms. And just for reference, a human birth control pill would have about 35,000 nanograms. So when you're talking about the amount of hormone that's naturally in any living, whether that's plant or animal that you eat, what's in food really ends up being pretty insignificant.
Great way to address that for sure. And I think too, like to your point again, like, these things are being tested at the point of processing to ensure, a safe product, that we can feel comfortable recommending, to our patients and clients, enjoying ourselves at home and so on and so forth. We're right around the 2:20 Eastern time mark here. So I don't know, Amy, if you would want to add anything else, maybe like at a high level, then we'll allow for more questions. I know this went so quickly. I feel like we could spend so much more time with you there on the farm.
Just going back to the sustainability issue, if I can just even point out, as I mentioned with our TMR mixer and mixing feed together, to give you an instance, we didn't used to use a TMR mixer. We were feeding so few animals, we couldn't justify the cost of that mixer, which is over $20,000. Our nutritionist had been hoping for years we'd get one, and we finally did a year and a half ago. And just to explain how the efficiency can be so different with how cattle are fed in the United States, our daily gain, when we were feeding cattle, we'd have hay out here and we'd pull it back and we'd put down grain twice a day for them to come eat. Now that is all mixed together like I showed you before, and the hay is chopped up. Just that change, they're eating the same weight of hay, the same weight of corn that they were before, but because we mixed it, they gain a whole additional pound per day than they used to. So that we went from 2.5 pounds a day gain to 3.5 plus. So just a little change of mixing feed has made a huge difference. And it's scientists, it's agronomists, it's cattle nutritionists, all coming up with and doing these studies that us farmers and ranchers can follow their science-based information and actually apply it on our farm and make a difference in sustainability.
I love that you kind of brought it back to the research point, which again, the audience that we're speaking to today really appreciates evidence-based, sound research and kind of rationale behind making those types of decisions. So thank you kind of for coming back full circle. I even get to a high-level sustainability question, so you kind of covered that, just to address that for the group too. And again, we'll share resources out related to some of these different topics that we have not been able to talk about in a lot of depth in our follow-up email. But I want to come back to the Q&A box. So again, we're around 2:23 Eastern time, so we're wrapping up very briefly. If you have any remaining questions, please drop those in the Q&A box so that we can pose those to both Sheri and Amy here on farm. I'll go back to a couple of the questions I was not able to address initially there with Sheri's presentation. I think here actually this would be more so directed to Sheri. If you can talk about buyers kind of assuming that grass-fed cattle have an improved quality of life over grain-fed. Is there any truth to that? And I'm throwing that back to you because you kind of talked about the nutritional piece of those two differences as well.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to just this, where everyone is in the United States, there's always a different story. But I also want to be realistic with you guys too, that the grass finished beef conversation is much more of a romanticized view for a lot of people, because if we go back to that geological map of the United States and you think about truly like our climate does not have green grass growing year round. And that's something we really have to be mindful of. Like, so you look out your door and you think about winter months, like what is actually growing and things of that sort. So just be mindful of that as you kind of think about that, because there is the romanticized view of it. However, cattle, at the end of the day, though, cattle spend the majority of their lives already on grass, right? So Amy talked about those different segments, right? So we have cow-calf producers, we have stocker operators. And the reason why we have different segments in the beef industry is because of our resources around us. And so they might move around a little bit because wherever they go ultimately is where the groceries are, right? And so ultimately they're spending about 70% of their lives already on grass. And then Amy just talked about that efficiency method of that too, right? We want them to be very efficient in their pounds gained, ultimately because they're the use of resources. And so that is also why United States has the most efficient beef finishing method there is, because of the feed yard setting as well too. And they're only in the feed yard setting for 4 to 6 months. It's a very short window. But ultimately, while they're there, the cattle care there is of top priority, because ultimately, no matter the size, no matter if it's someone that has 2 calves or someone that has 20,000, low stress and in a good, healthy environment, clean environment, we all win, right? Because at the end of the day, if we're producing an end product for the consumer that's something that they don't like, then that's going to impact our bottom line as well too. And so again, we go back to that sustainability definition of environmental, social, but also economical as well too. We all have to win, consumer as well as those that are producing it as well too. So I just kind of remind you, there's a lot of views and a lot of different ways that people can truly produce beef in the United States, and that is amazing. But whether they're grass finished or grain finished, I can assure you, you can be confident that animal care and open air and resources and all those things are of the most top priority of those that are actually raising it. Because again, they wouldn't be in business if it weren't.
Oh my gosh, Sheri, you've obviously done this before, because I feel like you checked the box on a couple of those questions in the box there. So thank you for doing so. That really that kind of tightened up our timeline here a little bit, because the one question was about when purchasing beef, how do you know if cattle is raised on a farm? Like what you all both have described with fresh air movement and so forth. Sheri just touched on that. The other question, I'll bring this to you, Amy, if there's anything you might want to add. But the question was just kind of about other states using food byproducts for feed. You spoke obviously to your own production. Is that something that's typical across the country, or if there's something you can add there?
So our area of the country, yes, there is. I'm glad you asked that. I'm in central Pennsylvania in Hershey, and Pennsylvania likes to tout themselves as the snack food capital of the world. There are a lot of chips and pretzels made here, and also Hershey chocolate. We're too small to use some of the byproducts from those foods, but we have a number of farms in our area that are finishing a larger number of cattle than we are. They use broken chips, pretzels. I think there are also some breakfast items that are made in the area that are used for feed, and also Hershey chocolate. We used to actually be able to feed some broken Kit Kats and Hershey Kisses, and that's our nutritionist would incorporate that energy into our ration in a smaller percentage, but at least it was going into feeding cattle rather than a landfill.
Awesome. Well, no, I love that you kind of regionalized it there as well. So we have about 2 more minutes. So I think sadly we're going to have to wrap up. So if there are any other questions that remain, please know that we will be sending you the survey in the follow-up email that you'll be able to have contact information. And I will happily get those questions to both Amy and or Sheri, depending on what the content of the question is. But at this point, we want to remind you that we are dropping a survey link in the chat in just a moment. We would love for you to complete that survey. It's just a couple of quick questions to really guide our future planning of such webinars for healthcare professionals just like this one. We also want to encourage you to do so by midnight tomorrow night, May 4th, for your chance to win a $25 beef swag pack. In our previous webinar, we had a really great completion rate of the survey. So please do complete that. That information and feedback is just so valuable to you. And thank you again for joining us today. It's been a privilege to have both Sheri and Amy here with us. I can't say enough about how wonderful it's been working with both of you, and just the level of expertise you bring to your presentations was just so great. We could have spent 3 hours together, I think, and not even still covered it all. And just one final note on our follow-up email. Again, you'll be receiving the survey link if you haven't grabbed it out of the chat box right there. Also the CPEU certificate. Again, this webinar was approved for 1.5 credit hours. And you will then also receive a couple of those additional resources that I mentioned in some of our conversation here as well. So again, thank you, Sheri. Thank you, Amy. We wish you all a wonderful rest of the day. And thank you again for your time today. Bye-bye.
Bye.